I like to collect things that remind me of my childhood. I occasionally wander through yard sales or thrift stores, looking for old toys like those I once owned, trinkets similar to the kind my grandmother collected, or old souvenirs from places I visited with my parents. This hobby of mine usually produces nothing but happiness, but last summer it was the source of a nightmare. I found it at some little old lady's yard sale, somewhat hidden between a box of old baseball cards and a milk crate full of beat-up action figures. People always joke that Furbies were creepy, but I absolutely adored mine when I was a kid. I considered it more of a friend than a toy and would spend hours talking to it and stroking its fur. While I held the black and white fuzzball in my hands, I couldn't help but remember the tea parties and games of house that I played with the pink one I carried everywhere 15 years ago. The little old lady that I bought it from didn't seem to remember having it, but happily reasoned that my grandkids have accumulated so many toys here over the years. I couldn't possibly keep track of everything. I politely listened as she told me about 2 grandsons and 3 granddaughters, how they used to visit every weekend until they grew up and moved on with lives and families of their own, before heading home with my newest treasure. I played with the Furby for a while, giggling at the childish gibberish it spoke and running my fingers over its still soft fur. The white on its belly was kind of dirty, and the fluff on top of its head was missing more than a few strands, but it worked well and made me happy. I placed it on the shelf in my bedroom before eating dinner and going to sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night to a kind of hissing sound coming from the doll. I removed the batteries and went back to bed. The next day I replaced the batteries and it seemed to be working again. I ran my fingers through the white fur on its head and vowed to be more careful with it when a clump of that fur came off in my hand. That night I woke yet again to the hissing sound, but this time it was louder. As I approached the Furby, I realized that it was whispering in its own language. I figured that it wasn't a stretch for a toy so old and well used to malfunction, so I removed the batteries and decided to only have them in when I was actually playing with it. My problem was solved for the time being. 3 days went by. I had been busy with work and such and hadn't paid much attention to any of the toys on my shelves. I had had a friend over for dinner and grabbed the Furby from my room to show it to him. We joked around and he messed with it for a few minutes while I cooked before he commented on the state of it. I know you love this thing, but wouldn't you be happier with one that's not in such bad shape? There are patches of fur missing and it's dirty. I knew about the missing bit from the top, but I could have sworn that the 2 dime-sized bald spots that he pointed out on his backside hadn't been there before. Perplexed, I mumbled something about it being well-loved before putting it back on the shelf and finishing dinner. After my friend left, I settled on the couch to watch some TV before bed. I heard a thump come from somewhere in the house, and muted the show so that I could listen for the source. Just as I was about to shrug it off as nothing and turn the volume back on, I heard another thump and the hee 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 the Furby makes when you tickle it. I armed myself with the umbrella I keep by the door and slowly made my way into my bedroom, wondering what kind of intruder would play with his victim's toys. It giggled again as I entered the room, ready to strike with my improvised weapon. There was no intruder, and the only sign of something being amiss was the Furby on the floor in the middle of the room. I checked every possible hiding spot, listening intently for footsteps or other signs of not being alone, before turning to leave the room to check the rest of the house. Right before I walked through the door, I heard the nasally voice of the toy behind me. Bleed! I turned to the toy as a shudder ran through me. I stared at it for a moment, wondering if I had heard it correctly. The lids of its eyes slowly shut and reopened before it spoke again. Die! Bleed! Die! I picked it up and practically ran to my front door to throw it outside. As I shut the door, I heard it laugh again. I tried to continue watching TV, but the little monster on my front lawn prevented me from focusing on what was happening on the screen. After about an hour of jumping at every little noise and nervously glancing at the windows, that looked out at the yard. I went to bed and spent the next night dreaming about tiny fuzzy demons attacking me. The next morning, I sleepily got ready for work while still trying to shake off the encounter and the nightmares it caused. I opened the front door, intending to not even glance at the thing that sat somewhere in my grass, and froze in my tracks at the sight of it on my front porch. The Furby sat in the center of the front step, surrounded by blood and clumps of light brown fur. Its yellow plastic beak had a small piece of meat hanging from it, as if I had caught it mid-bite. It had lost a lot more fur, so much that I could see the plastic underneath, and what was left of it was matted and brown. Sitting inches away from the doll's tiny feet was a dead rabbit. Its body had been picked clean to the bones, and only the head remained intact. Beady little eyes stared into nothingness. The tip of its tongue hung from the side of its mouth and rested in its own blood on the porch's wooden floorboards. I turned away from the gore and gagged as I slammed the door. After running into the bathroom to lose my breakfast, I called out of work and debated what I could do about the tiny terror. My friends and family would think I was crazy. The police would probably take me away. I came to the conclusion rather quickly that I was on my own. I grabbed a couple of garbage bags and some cleaning supplies and cleaned up the mess on my porch. The first thing I did was bag up the Furby and put it in the trash can by the curb. The garbage man would take it away the next day, and just the thought of that made me feel better. The rest of my day was quiet, and the horrors of the morning were a distant thought by the time I went to sleep. I was jolted awake by an ear-piercing shriek. I looked around my darkened bedroom, trying to figure out where the sound came from, when something slammed against the closed door so hard that a picture fell off the wall next to it. The wailing continued as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hand shaking so badly that I almost dropped the phone as I pressed the numbers. I screamed and cowered in the corner when another slam on the door cracked the wood in the center, threatening to split it in half and let the assailant in. Silence filled my home, but the operator stayed on the phone with me until the police came in case whoever was trying to break in was still around. The cops found my doors and windows still locked and closed, and once they came in, their search of the house turned up nothing as well. After taking my statement and telling me to call if anything else happened, they left. Knowing that I wouldn't be able to sleep anymore that night, I went to grab a blanket off my bed so I could curl up on the couch and watch a movie. I turned on the light in my bedroom and almost jumped out of my skin. The Furby sat in the middle of my bed. There was barely any fur left on it, and its once brown eyes were now blood red. I slammed the door shut as it began howling. It shouted the words, "Bleed! Die!" over and over as it threw itself against the door, splintering the wood along the crack it had made earlier. I grabbed my keys and ran out of the house. It was the middle of the night and I had forgotten to grab my phone and wallet, so I decided to drive around until it was a decent enough hour to knock on someone's door and ask to stay there for a while. Before long I was getting delirious from the lack of sleep and decided to pull over and rest my eyes for a while. It wasn't until I looked around to make sure I was alone that I realized where I had stopped, right in front of the house of the old lady that had sold me the Furby. After arguing with myself for a while, I decided to talk to her in the morning. As I closed my eyes and tried to ignore how uncomfortable it was trying to sleep in the front seat of a car, I thought about how I could get information from her without seeming completely nuts. Before I knew it, I opened my eyes to the bright sunlight shining through the windows. I checked my hair in the rearview mirror, stretched my arms and legs, and then walked up the short sidewalk that led to the house. I opened the screen door and knocked, and was surprised when the inner door swung open a bit. I called out a greeting before pushing the door open a little farther. When I stuck my head through the doorway, I was assaulted by an awful stench mere seconds before finding the source. The sweet little old lady who had sold me the Furby was lying on her back in the center of the living room floor. The color in her once brown eyes had paled and glazed over, and her sagging skin had begun to turn gray. My entrance had spooked a large orange cat that had been tearing away at her skin on her cheek and mouth, leaving a jagged hole through which I could see her teeth and gums. It hissed at me before abandoning its meal and disappearing into the house. The sight and smell drove me back outside, where I retched in the bushes before knocking on a neighbor's door to ask for help. I spent a few hours there, repeatedly explaining to the police why I was there and how I had found her. I left out the part about being terrorized by an old plaything, and simply said that I wanted to see if she had any toys left over from the yard sale that I could buy. When they finally said I could leave, I got into my car and drove away without yet deciding where I would go. I had traveled about a mile before I heard a rustling sound in my back seat. It was a good thing that no one was behind me, because when I saw the Furby sitting against the passenger side door, I slammed on the brakes and jumped out of my car in a panic. It began laughing as I paced the street with my hands pulling at the roots of my hair, but it was no longer the slow giggle. Instead, it was a heinous cackle, deep and clear, with no hint of nasal childlike voice. Tears of anger filled my eyes. I was tired of being scared, done with being bullied by something that I could hold in my hands. More than fed up, I decided to end this. I got back in my car and drove home, clutching the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white while trying to ignore the laughter and chants of "bleed, die" that came from the back seat. After parking in my driveway, I grabbed the doll by the ear that hadn't fallen off yet and carried it to the backyard. I threw it in my charcoal grill, doused it with lighter fluid, and threw a match into the basin. I watched as the remaining fur and cloth burned away before the plastic underneath began to melt. The Furby wasn't laughing anymore. It screamed in agony, its voice getting lower and more distorted as it was reduced to a pile of black plastic goo. When it finally went silent, the flames changed from a bright red-orange to a deep green. Thick, black smoke poured off of the mess as the flames died down, and it all ended with a bang that sounded as if someone shot a gun right next to my ear. In seconds, the fire went out completely and the smoke cleared. Relieved that the whole ordeal seemed to finally be over, I looked into the bottom of the grill to assess the damage. It was empty. I can tell you with certainty that most of you who are reading this have had an imaginary friend at one point. A friend you made up because you needed someone or something to play with, or to simply kill everyday boredom. These friends vary from person to person. Most people who had imaginary friends described them as human-like figures with characteristics that described their own personalities. However, no matter how hard you try, making anyone else believe that your imaginary friend is real is nearly impossible. No one, except you, truly believes in your imaginary friend. When I was 5 or 6, I started kindergarten. Not many of the other kids there would talk to me, and I wouldn't start a conversation due to my shy nature. I went through kindergarten with no friends and not enjoying anything about my upcoming years of education. It wasn't until the beginning of first grade that I met Nick. Nick was the first to talk to me, later explaining that his imaginary friend, Eric, wanted us to meet each other. As Nick and I became better friends, he would talk to me about Eric, translating his words and emotions so that we could have one-on-one conversations with each other. As a kid, I thought Eric was like a game, and the rules were made up by Nick. After a couple weeks, I became more tuned to Eric's personality. Nick would no longer have to translate what he'd say. It became more like talking to a real person. When second grade came, Nick had to leave. Because of his absence, I no longer had any friends. I figured I'd make an imaginary friend, like Eric. Soon I created Greg, my new best friend. My parents soon became aware of Greg, seeing him as just a silly game that I'd soon grow out of. Before long, I had a bond with Greg, almost like Nick and Eric. However, Greg was more like me. Every day I would go outside with Greg and we'd run around the yard and do normal childhood shit, like throwing rocks into a pond or exploring the woods. As I went further into life, like around 4th grade, I soon made real friends. My interactions with Greg became less frequent. When I was with my friends, I imagined Greg sad and alone, but I still did not talk to him. By middle school, my thoughts of Greg were completely erased. All the time I spent was either by myself or with my friends, doing things Greg and I used to do. In the winter, when I was in 7th grade, I was sledding and throwing snowballs with my friends. This part I remember well, We were at a large hill, trying to see who could go the fastest and bragging about how good we were at sledding. It was one of the moments you'd never forget. All of us were having fun, until I saw him. Greg. He was standing at the bottom of the hill, shivering in the cold, looking at me with sad eyes. I blinked multiple times, trying to clear the images of him from my mind, as I was shocked to see him again. He wouldn't leave. He just stood there, his expression turning angrier the longer I stared at him. I followed his gaze as he stared at my friends with pure hatred. I looked back at him and he slowly vanished. Although I never saw him for the rest of 7th grade, I never stopped thinking about that day. His face was imprinted in my mind, almost haunting me. I decided to get rid of my remorse by completely cutting myself off from Greg. I destroyed pictures and things I had written about him. The only thing I could not destroy was my memories of him. I thought about Greg less and went on with my life. In my freshman year of high school, I started to see Greg again. However, he was no longer the image of him I had as a child. His face was sunken, and there was no emotion in his eyes. I started seeing him sitting down in my classroom and at my lunch table. The one strange thing was, no one would sit where he was or walk where he walked. It was almost like he was a real person. He showed up wherever I was. All he'd do was follow me. It wasn't too noticeable, but it was obvious he was still there. The more we saw each other, the more I saw he changed his expression. He became angrier and started showing up in unexpected places. He was scaring me to the point that I couldn't sleep, and when I did, he would be there, watching me. He began to show up more often in more places. I started sleeping less, doing worse in school, and drifted from my friends. My parents tried to figure out what was happening to me, but they couldn't. They started counseling appointments later on, visits from the doctor, all of whom couldn't figure out what was the matter. I was declared insane and taken to a mental hospital where Greg would stare at me for hours, driving me even more insane. I became very anxious, seeing images of Greg threatening to kill me. I started to talk to Greg, asking, "Why are you doing this? And what's making you so angry?" But he never responded. Then, finally, he started to repeat 4 words. "Please don't leave me." Each time he said it, he got louder until he was screaming, his face contorting into a deep, evil smile. This is my last day. As I finish typing this, I will end my torment and get rid of Greg forever. My advice to you is, never forget your imaginary friends. If you are reading this, then I am dead, and you are standing aboard a derelict Cyclone-class patrol ship, the USS Mistral, with her engines dead and her electrical systems non-functional. I am, or was, the commanding officer of this vessel, Lieutenant Commander Ryan Simmons. Please read this carefully. If you are an officer or enlisted man in the United States Navy, this is an order. Scuttle this vessel immediately. Do not finish this letter. Get off the Mistral at once and send her down. Consider this a quarantine scenario. All hands are likely dead. God help you, if they are not. We are 8 days out of Kirkwall, tracking an intermittent and scrambled distress call from what appeared to be an Icelandic fishing vessel, the Magnus Dotir, deep in the no-fishing zone of the North Sea. We found the vessel, or rather, we found a mile-wide streak of oil and fragments, the largest of them still burning. The night before, the enlisted man on watch had reported seeing a flash of light on the horizon. The Magnus Dotir's crew was nowhere to be found, except for one lone fisherman, unburned and floating at the far end of the debris field. He had been shot in the forehead with a small caliber revolver. When we fished his pale blue corpse from the frigid water, he was still clutching a fishing knife in one clamped hand. What we were able to piece together from the fragmented and confounding evidence was that for reasons unknown, the crew had been in conflict, resulting in the murder of at least one sailor and the eventual sabotage and destruction of the ship. Visibility was only a few hundred feet as we spent the next day drifting silently among the debris, in hopes of finding a survivor. The crew was already visibly shaken by the discovery, the grim dread of the fog, and lone smoldering pieces of the Magnus Dotier that collided with our hull unsettled even the most seasoned of us. We had expected an easy cruise and the simple retrieval of a dozen thankful Icelandic fishermen. What we got, at first, was a silent and oil-slick coated sea, a single corpse, and more than a few nagging questions. The Mistral had just been serviced after an extended tour with the Atlantic Fleet in Bahrain before her transfer to the North Sea. She was in good running order, so I can only assume that the initial mechanical failure was an act of sabotage, or of some external force. It happened the first night, when our final sweep had been completed and we returned to the site of the Magnus Dotier's first transmission. There was nothing initially remarkable about the spot, a cold, lonely set of coordinates and little else. I was in my cabin, just sitting down when the call sounded from the captain, offering little information, just a stern order to meet him on the deck. Dressing quickly, I emerged from my cabin into a cloud of palpable unease and fear. The enlisted men and junior officers were coursing through the ship towards the deck, like panicked rats. No one made eye contact, or spoke. There was none of the usual gallows humor or camaraderie that bubbles up in situations of limited information, just a grim inertia that pulled us into the Arctic night. On deck, the night was unnaturally clear and cold, and the bright of the stars burned in the frosty air. Around us in every direction, just a few hundred yards away, the fog and clouds whirled as if held at bay by our presence. The captain was at a railing, leaning over along with the men on watch. I approached him, suddenly desperate and panicked to know what was happening, when I saw it, the light flooding up from beneath us. The sea was flat, like the surface of a mirror. The water was black, reflecting the pale pinpricks of stars, but beneath the surface something glowed with a cold light. Pulsating shapes of violet, green, and deep cobalt blue shone from beneath. They flowed and merged and shimmered silently, deep below the glassy sea. We stared, 24 men and women, struck dumb and horrified by the sight. There was a sense of scale that emerged from the fluid movement of the lights. They seemed to be many fathoms beneath us, which would make them terribly large and impossibly fast. There were no solid shapes and no disturbance of the water, just a deep field of liquid flowing light. We watched for what seemed like hours, entranced by the mesmerizing ballet of cold light, a mere reflection of the northern lights. When it ended, abruptly, there were 3 almost simultaneous events. First, the lights seemed to contract, each mote freezing in place and collapsing like the iris of an eye in bright sunlight. Secondly, there was a tremor in the air that first raised the hair on the back of my neck. As the ghostly lights winked out of existence, it rose in intensity, until I thought my eyeballs might shake their way out of my head. Through the fog of sudden pain, I heard a noise rising above the Arctic wind, a humming vibration from the Mistral herself that matched the electric shuddering in my skull. It was as if every light bulb aboard the Mistral was suddenly flushed with power, flaring bright and buzzing noisily in their housings. And then, when the wine had reached a fever pitch, they began to pop and shatter among a shatter of sparks. From start to finish it lasted less than 2 seconds, and we were left floating silently in the dark waters, beneath the starry sky, on a dead and crippled boat. The damage was invisible, without any obvious cause, and total. Nothing aboard the Mistral worked. Each carefully crafted system of multiple redundancies had crumbled. Every light was shattered, and even the replacement bulbs and the small flashlights we all carried held fused and useless filaments. Satellite phones, shortwave radios, all means of communication were useless bricks of plastic and wire. Every battery was dead. Every stereo system was silent. We were adrift, without sail or engine, isolated from the world by 100 miles of black and silent sea. The crew moved through the ship that first night like moles, fumbling through the dark corridors with only a few pale green chemical lights to check each system. They relayed each disheartening message like a fire brigade through the darkness, to where the captain and I stood on deck, trying to make sense of the senseless. At last, when nothing else could be done, I fumbled my way back to my cabin and tried to sleep, the darkness feeling like an impressive, many-fingered hand slowly gripping my chest. The next morning, I again took stock of our situation, hoping for some fragment of hope we had passed by in the night. The damage was total. We would have to find a way to send a distress call, and hope that we had not drifted too far from our last known coordinates. The men may not have known the full details, but it was clear from their haunted visages that they knew how dire the situation was. The first death was that afternoon. The sounds of screaming brought me above deck and into a thick, heavy fog. High in the gloom, I could see bright, burning specks of light, descending slowly. My stomach turned. It was 2 signal flares drifting uselessly through the haze. Some damn fool had fired the signal flares. I burned with an unfamiliar and foreign rage, and rushed through the fog to the foredeck, with hatred in my blood and my fists clamped tight. The scene that emerged from the fog broke me from my stupor. The enlisted man, a flare gun still in his hand, lay broken in a pool of blood. The captain stood over him, clutching the railing, driving the heel of his boot repeatedly into the broken mess of the boy's skull. I realized then that the screaming I heard, the high keening wail, was coming from the captain, his face in a rictus of animal rage. Around them was a small crowd standing motionless and silent, watching like sentinels. The captain turned to see me and dropped into a crouch, his fingers wrapping around the flare gun, and he raised it level with my eyes. We stared for a long moment at each other, our eyes locked as he panted heavily, his face lightly splattered with blood. The only sound was the wet gurgling exhale of the enlisted man's death rattle, a bubble of blood forming on his ruined face. I'd served with this man for nearly a decade. This was not the man I knew. This was a hollow simulacrum, filled with violence and terror. I spoke to him then, in a soothing voice. I asked him to hand me the flare gun. He said nothing at first, and then spoke, his voice a tiny trembling sound that was swallowed up by the thick gloom around us. He's murdered us, Ryan. The fog. The flares will never... He shook his head and clenched his eyes tight, as if he were trying to shake himself from a dream. Then he shuddered once, violently, his back arching like a seizure. This little fuck killed us, he choked out. The flare gun wavered in the air, and I took a step closer, reaching out for him. He opened his eyes, and I froze again as we stared silently at one another. You're gonna die here, he giggled quietly. I always wanted to watch you die, you fucking coward. He tilted his head back and laughed, one hyena-like bark to the gray sky, and then put the flare gun in his mouth and fired, the last flare igniting and temporarily bathing his head in a halo of magnesium orange and smoke. He tumbled back over the railing. If there was a splash when he hit the water, it was swallowed by the fog. I stood for what seemed like a very long time. It slowly dawned on me that I was alone, the silent audience having melted away below decks, no doubt taking the grim tale with them. I feared for morale, an absurd concern, I realize now, but could not move from the spot, as if sheer force of will would cause the sea to regurgitate this man, my friend. The first gunshot broke me from my reverie. In the emergency lockers, I found that a handful of flare guns remained, and I stuffed one into each pocket and entered the dim passageway below deck. Over the hollow retort of gunshots, other muffled sounds began to emerge, the choking sobs, the screams of pain and anger, all bringing the faint impression of the copper smell of blood. The dark was oppressive and thick as my heart rose in my chest. The pale fading light of the chemical glow sticks that hung at regular intervals illuminated the bare corridor, and I slowly moved towards my cabin. It had been sacked and my service pistol was missing. The next 2 cabins held the corpses of the junior officers, their broken forms still in their bunks. Skulls opened like blossoming flowers under the point-blank shots. I felt the distinct and irrational desire to run on deck and leap overboard, to swim away from the boat into the unknown sea. I gripped a flare gun and held it out in front of me, less like a weapon and more like a talisman, and began to pace slowly down the corridor to the enlisted bunks. The door was wide open and the smell of blood and fear and shit was nauseating. As my eyes slowly adjusted to the dim, I saw a field of bodies, torn, shredded, and shattered by bullets and makeshift clubs. A few of the men still moved, twitching slightly. I watched in frozen terror as one man, his face a mask of blood and rage, turned up his head to regard me, and with a weak cry of rage, began to drag himself with his arms, trailing a broken and shattered leg towards me. From the shadows, another form pounced on him, a boot digging into the wounded man's back with a wet cracking sound. I recognized the attacker's face in the green chemical dim, a quiet and bookish young man. Like the captain, this was not the man I knew. This was a beast that wore his skin. He reached down and grabbed the wounded man's jaw, thumb slipping into his mouth. The wounded man growled, a feral, mindless sound, and tried to bite down, but his attacker gripped tight and pulled. The jaw came off with a sound of tearing tendons and an undulating shriek that vanished into the air. I was no longer breathing, holding silently at the entrance, but the attacker snapped his head up to see me, nostrils flaring. The jawbone hit the floor with a meaty sound, and he lunged towards me with silent animal grace. I fired the flare gun and hit him square in the chest. His shirt caught fire, and all air escaped his lungs with a sudden and forceful exhale. But impossibly, he continued towards me. As I passed through the portal and slammed the door, the fire had climbed into his hair and he was squealing now, his clawed hands still outstretched towards me. I felt him impact the door, and saw that nightmare visage wreathed in fire through the small porthole, lips already burnt away to reveal 2 rows of perfect teeth. He wailed and began to smash his burning form against the door, once, twice, 3 times, and then silence. I raised my eyes to the porthole and saw only the faint image of the burning shape as it disappeared into the darkness. All conscious thought evaporated and I fled from that carnal house. I have barricaded all entrances to below deck now, and have doomed myself to slow death at the hands of the enveloping cold. I can still hear the living ones down there, screaming and banging on the doors. They are not the men that I knew. I console myself with this thought, as I leave them in the dark to starve or murder each other. If you have read this far, and have not fled these waters, or God forbid, are still aboard the Mistral, then I beg you again, leave now, while you can. Do not look below deck. There are none of us left to save, and certainly none worth saving. It's cold now, with the fading day surrendering the warm gray light to the dark. There are no stars this night, nothing but the heavy blanket of night. If I could get below, I would find some way of destroying the Mistral, like the brave men of the Magnus Dotir, but it's too late. The most I can make of my last moments, as all feeling flees my extremities, and writing becomes impossible, is a warning. Please, send us into the deep, tell no one you found us, and never return. There are things and primal desires older than man, and forces beyond the grasp of our simple minds, and they dwell here, beneath the frozen sea. Thanks for listening, and remember, you cannot hide from the void.